Right now, a single unnamed analyst sitting on a tiny boat in the Middle East is holding a pair of binoculars. And the math he is scribbling on a water-resistant notepad is actively deciding how much you're going to pay for a gallon of milk next week. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, it really sounds like the opening scene of an espionage thriller, right?
Yeah.
But it is the actual unvarnished reality of the global supply chain at this exact moment. I
Hmm.
mean, we are looking at a planetary system that is currently running on incredibly fragile, like highly localized information.
Exactly. And for you listening, that is exactly our mission today. We have a massive stack of source materials in front of us, dense financial reports, geopolitical intelligence dispatches, tech
Uh,
industry filings, even clinical pharmaceutical data.
it's a lot
It's a
of
huge stack. And we are going to connect all of these seemingly disparate dots. We are tracing a direct line from the tense, contested waters of global geopolitical choke points straight into the artificial intelligence revolution that is actively rewriting your personal finances and your career trajectory.
right? Routing right through the shifting landscapes of corporate America and then taking it all the way to humanity's farthest journey into deep space. The scope of the material we are synthesizing is vast, but the underlying connections are actually surprisingly intimate.
Yeah, and we're taking this journey because this deep dive is your curated shortcut to being the most well-informed person in the room. We aren't just looking at isolated abstract news items that scroll across a ticker.
No, absolutely not.
We want to show you how the gears of global conflict physically turn the dials on your grocery bill, dictate your job prospects, and rewrite your tax returns.
Well, before we dive into the mechanics of those systems, I do need to provide a crucial framing note for our listeners, because the source materials we're unpacking today contain highly charged political developments.
Very charged.
Yeah. They involve actions, policies, legal maneuvers, and investigations surrounding prominent figures across the entire political spectrum, involving both left-wing and right-wing leaders. So throughout this analysis, we are impartially reporting on the content provided to convey the ideas contained in the original sources.
Right.
We are not endorsing any viewpoints, political policies, or geopolitical ultimatums. We are simply unpacking the facts, the historical context, and the economic data exactly as they are presented in the text.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you think about the interconnected global economy, it operates a lot like a massive, highly complex escape room.
That's a good way to look at it.
Right. It is not just that things are connected, it is that the mechanisms are entirely hidden from view. You pull a lever in the Middle East, say, disrupting a major shipping lane, and it triggers a gear in London, which drops a weight in New York, and suddenly a hidden trapdoor opens up right in the middle of your local supermarket, doubling the price of fresh produce.
Yeah, and the lever that the entire financial world is staring at right now is the Strait of Hormuz.
Ah!
We have to begin at the absolute center of current global anxiety.
Because it's not just a body of water, is it?
No, not at all. It is a critical, irreplaceable artery for the world's energy supply. Roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption passes through this specific choke point. And the physical geography is what makes it so vulnerable.
It's tiny.
Exactly. At its narrowest functional point for massive oil tankers, the shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in either direction. So the escalating conflict between the U.S. and Iran has essentially brought this vital corridor to a standstill.
And the timeline we are looking at in these intelligence reports is incredibly tense. I mean, President Donald Trump has issued a very strict, highly public ultimatum. He has stated that if the Strait of Hormuz is not fully reopened by Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. military will launch major targeted attacks on Iranian infrastructure.
And the phrasing he used was striking, wasn't it?
Yeah, he specifically called it Power Plant Day and Bridge Day all wrapped up in one.
Right. But alongside those public declarations, the source documents reveal a fascinating layer of back-channel diplomacy happening in the shadows. There is a reported 45-day ceasefire proposal currently on the table.
Oh, really? Who put that together?
It was quietly put together by officials in Pakistan and is being mediated through Oman. The proposed framework includes a specific protocol for allowing safe passage through the strait, a timeline for regional reconstruction, and a phased lifting of economic sanctions.
But Trump's reaction to that specific ceasefire proposal was not exactly a full endorsement, based on the reports. He called the Omani-mediated framework a significant step, but explicitly stated that it is not good enough to halt the ultimatum.
Yeah, and he even floated a completely different economic paradigm entirely.
Right, because Iran recently passed a domestic bill to collect tolls on vessels traversing the strait.
Exactly. And Trump suggested that perhaps the United States should be the entity charging those maritime tolls. He posed the question publicly, saying, why shouldn't we? We're the winner.
So when you have this kind of binary outcome looming over the market, a sudden negotiated truce on one side versus a massive infrastructure destroying military escalation on the other, it causes absolute whiplash in global finance.
Absolute chaos. Investors are being forced to position billions of dollars for two starkly divergent realities. When the conflict initially spiked, we saw the spot price for current physical cargoes of Brent crude oil skyrocketed to $141.36 a barrel.
Wow.
Yeah. To put that in perspective, that is a level of pricing trauma we haven't witnessed since the depths of the 2008 financial crisis. Then, on the mere whisper of this 45-day ceasefire proposal, prices began to violently pull back.
See, I was looking at the domestic jobs report data and the source files, and it seemed completely out of sync with the panic happening in the oil markets. We supposedly added something like 178,000 jobs in March.
Which absolutely crushed the conservative expectations of 59,000.
Right, and unemployment fell to 4.3%. So the domestic economy looks like it is chugging along nicely, but the bond markets are simultaneously panicking about stagflation, pushing the 10-year Treasury yield up over 4.3%.
Yeah.
Let's define that term for a second, because stagflation sounds like an abstract economics concept, but it is actually the ultimate nightmare scenario for a consumer.
It really is. Stagflation is essentially an economic paradox that central banks absolutely dread. Normally, inflation happens when an economy is running too hot. People have lots of money, they buy lots of things, and prices go up.
Makes sense.
Conversely, when the economy slows down and unemployment rises, prices usually drop. But stagflation is the worst of both worlds. It is stagnant economic growth and high unemployment combined with soaring inflation.
So you're losing your job, and everything is getting more expensive at the same time.
Exactly. The fear reflected in the bond market right now is that this massive spike in energy costs from the Strait of Hormuz will act like a tax on the entire global economy, crushing corporate growth, while simultaneously driving the price of everyday goods through the roof. The strong jobs report is the only thing keeping the market from fully capitulating to that fear, but it is a very precarious balance.
Which brings us back to the guy on the boat. Because the dominant narrative gripping those panicked markets is that the Strait of Hormuz is a solid brick wall right now. Nothing is getting through. But a boutique Wall Street research firm called Citrini Research decided to completely ignore the standard satellite data.
Well, they kind of had to. The standard operating procedure for maritime intelligence is to track the Automatic Identification System, or AIS. Every large commercial vessel uses these transponders to broadcast their identity, cargo, and heading.
But because of the severe military threat, ship captains are turning their transponders off, right?
Yes, they are deliberately going dark to avoid being targeted. Satellites can still spot large metal objects moving on the water, but they struggle to definitively identify the flag, the cargo, or the ultimate destination if the electronic signature is missing. Citrini recognized that relying on digital data in a conflict zone was creating a blind spot.
So they literally sent an unnamed analyst to the Musandam Peninsula in Oman. He hired a small boat, went out onto the water, and just started counting ships with his own eyes.
Just looking at it.
Yeah, and the report claims this analyst discovered roughly 15 massive ships a day are actually passing through the Kashim Channel. I have to push back on the validity of this, though. It feels like standing in a fast food drive-thru with a clipboard to calculate a multinational corporation's quarterly earnings. How is one person's visual estimate overriding the intelligence of global satellite networks?
I know, it sounds absurd on its face, but the methodology taps into the mechanics of the shadow economy. When vessels go dark, they don't simply vanish. They enter a localized, highly informal system of transit. The Citrini analyst didn't just count ships. He embedded with local fishermen and maritime smugglers to understand the underlying mechanics of the blockage. What he discovered is that the Strait of Hormuz is not functioning as a brick wall. Think of it more like a corrupt bouncer at an exclusive nightclub. It is a functional checkpoint.
Oh, I see. So the bouncer isn't turning everyone away. He's just demanding a bribe, checking VIP lists, and making the line move at an agonizing crawl.
Precisely. Iran is selectively allowing certain ships to pass if they secure prior back-channel approval. It's a managed trickle of energy, not a total blockade.
Interesting.
Citrini expects this localized disruption to persist, eventually bringing traffic up to perhaps 50% of pre-conflict levels in the coming weeks. The market impact of a bouncer rather than a wall is that it embeds a permanent risk premium into oil prices. The oil will arrive, but it will be chronically expensive.
And let's trace that expensive oil directly to the listener. Because a permanent risk premium sounds like a problem for hedge fund managers. But the reality of that functional checkpoint in the Middle East is that it drives a massive, unavoidable grocery shock straight to your local supermarket.
It absolutely does.
How does a barrel of Brent crude oil dictate the price of a tomato?
The connective tissue is diesel fuel. When raw crude oil goes up, the refined price of diesel immediately follows. Diesel is the absolute lifeblood of the global agricultural supply chain. It powers the massive tractors that till the soil and harvest the crops. It powers the freight trains and the long-haul trucks that move the food from rural farms to urban distribution centers.
But the petroleum dependency goes much deeper than just transportation, right? Like the actual fertilizer used to grow the crops is heavily dependent on the global supply chains flowing through that strait.
Yes, many synthetic fertilizers are petrochemical products derived from natural gas and oil refining processes. Furthermore, the plastic packaging used to keep your food fresh on the shelf is entirely petroleum-based. Every single input cost for a farmer and a distributor is spiking simultaneously.
And according to the International Fresh Produce Association, fresh produce is going to hit the absolute hardest and fastest.
Because of the shelf life.
Exactly. If you harvest a field of grain, you can stockpile it in a dry silo for months and wait for transportation costs to drop. You cannot do that with a strawberry. Produce requires a constant, uninterrupted cold chain. It has to stay refrigerated from the moment it leaves the field, into the back of the truck, into the warehouse, and onto the grocery store display.
And that continuous refrigeration requires massive amounts of energy.
Right, and the timing of this incoming grocery shock is brutal because it is materializing right before the U.S. midterm elections. Food inflation is already incredibly sticky in the minds of voters, and this geopolitical bottleneck adds an entirely new, uncontrollable layer of pressure to household budgets.
We are also seeing fascinating secondary market impacts radiating outward from this fuel surge. Let's look at aviation. Jet fuel is currently pushing $4.65 a gallon.
Wow.
Yeah. And if you examine the private aviation sector, which operates on razor-thin margins despite its luxury branding, charter brokers like Vimana and Amalfi Jets are reporting that the cost to fly private has spiked by 20% almost overnight.
Just from the fuel.
Yes. A heavy jet flight from Dubai to London that cost $400,000 last year just booked for $520,000. Fleet operators are being forced to slap massive, unexpected fuel surcharges on flights that clients booked and paid for months ago.
It's an incredible trickle-down effect, cascading from massive shipping conglomerates down to private jet charters and ultimately landing right in your grocery cart.
Yeah.
But on a larger geopolitical scale, sovereign nations are having to make incredibly tough, pragmatic choices to secure their domestic energy. The source materials detail how India is navigating this shock by actively pivoting their entire energy strategy.
India is currently the world's third largest oil importer. They are incredibly vulnerable to this specific choke point because half of their crude oil and the vast majority of their liquid petroleum gas, which serves as the primary cooking fuel for millions of Indian households, comes directly through the Strait of Hormuz.
So what are they doing?
Because the conflict drove the price of their specific crude basket from $69 a barrel up to $113. India is now turning directly to Iran to purchase oil and gas for the first time in 7 years.
And they're making this pivot while explicitly ignoring a request from President Trump. The U.S. proposed a naval coalition to forcefully protect the shipping lanes in the region, and India declined to join.
Right. They essentially calculated that it was safer and far more economically viable to negotiate bilaterally with Tehran for safe passage than to join a Western military coalition and risk being targeted.
Goldman Sachs released an analysis predicting that India can weather this macroeconomic shock, actually forecasting their currency, the rupee, to trade over 95 against the dollar. It is a massive realignment of strategic partnerships, driven entirely by the cold calculus of energy needs.
Yeah, and the volatility surrounding these events also exposes a much darker, highly speculative side of how financial systems react to global conflict. The source materials highlight a severe controversy surrounding Polymarket, which raises profound questions about the morality of modern markets.
Let's explain Polymarket for the listener. It is a decentralized prediction market platform. Instead of betting on sports, users place financial wagers on real-world events, political elections, economic data releases, and in this case, military outcomes.
Which gets very dark very quickly.
It does. An American F-15E fighter jet was recently shot down over Iran. One crew member was rescued, but the other remained missing in hostile territory. And users on Polymarket were actually placing financial wagers on the specific date the downed pilot would be rescued or recovered.
And the public reaction was visceral. Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts, who is himself a combat veteran, initiated an intense public backlash against the platform. He labeled the market disgusting and pointed out the grim reality that anonymous users were financially profiting off the potential death, capture, or rescue of American service members.
Polymarket ultimately folded under the pressure and removed the wagers, releasing a statement that the specific betting pool didn't meet their internal integrity standards. But the incident highlights a massive, growing tension in decentralized finance.
Absolutely.
Representative Moulton has since banned his congressional staff from using prediction markets and is aggressively pushing for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, to heavily regulate or outright ban wagers on war, casualties, and sensitive government actions. It really shows how blockchain technology allows us to financially securitize almost any aspect of human tragedy if left unchecked.
Well, and if the physical supply chains are experiencing this kind of unpredictable bouncer-at-the-door friction and prediction markets are turning conflict into a casino, you would expect the traditional financial institutions funding the global economy to seek out as much regulatory stability as possible.
You would think so.
But looking at the source materials on corporate leadership, we are seeing the exact opposite.
Right, we are seeing top financial leaders and regulatory bodies reacting to and sometimes openly fighting against government policy in the midst of all this global uncertainty.
Yeah.
The prime example the documents highlight is JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon. He just released his highly anticipated annual shareholder letter. He acknowledges all the massive geopolitical risks we just discussed, Iran, Ukraine, China, and he accurately calls war the realm of uncertainty. But then he pivots incredibly hard to domestic issues,
It really does.
specifically leveling harsh, unprecedented criticism at U.S. banking regulators.
Right. Diamond targeted the revised regulatory proposals for the Basel III endgame and the capital surcharges imposed on global systemically important banks, or GSIBs. He argued that the new rules would require JP Morgan to hold as much as 50% more capital against loans made to U.S. consumers and businesses compared to smaller regional banks.
And he publicly called the regulations nonsensical and went so far as to label them un-American.
Which is strong language for a bank CEO.
Let's pause and translate that. I see these acronyms, Basel III, GSIBs, thrown around in the financial press constantly, but what is the actual mechanism in play here? How does a banking rule written in Switzerland stop a commercial bank in New York from giving a loan to a bakery in Ohio?
The mechanism is all about capital reserves. Following the devastating 2008 financial crisis, international regulators convened in Basel, Switzerland, to create rules ensuring banks would never again require massive taxpayer bailouts. The core mechanism they developed is called risk-weighted assets. If a bank loans $1 million to a volatile tech startup, regulators require the bank to keep a large percentage of its own cash locked away in a vault, essentially held in reserve, in case that loan defaults.
Makes sense?
But if they loan $1 million to a highly stable government entity, they have to hold much less in reserve.
So the bank can't use that reserve cash to invest or to issue new mortgages or to pay out dividends. It just sits there acting as a shock absorber.
Exactly. The Basel III endgame represents the final, strictest iteration of these rules. And the GSIB surcharge is an extra penalty applied only to the massive interconnected banks like JP Morgan, because if they fail, the entire system collapses.
Right.
The mechanism Davin is fighting against is that regulators are fundamentally changing the math on how risk is calculated. They are forcing the bank to hold billions of dollars more in reserve for everyday activities.
And Diamond's argument is that this regulatory framework has morphed from a necessary safety net into a fragmented, slow-moving bureaucracy that actively destroys productive lending. He is stating that in a time of severe global economic fragility, the U.S. government is intentionally handcuffing its largest financial engines.
Preventing them from providing necessary capital to small businesses and consumers.
And that intense friction isn't just happening between commercial banks and regulators. There is massive overlapping political drama happening inside the regulatory bodies themselves, specifically the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, the Fed is dealing with its own chaos right now.
A nomination hearing is set for April 16th for Kevin Warsh to become the next Fed chair. But Senator Tom Tillis is publicly blocking the nomination from moving forward. And the reason for the blockage is entirely separate from monetary policy. Tillis is blocking the new nominee because there is an ongoing criminal probe by the Department of Justice into the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell.
Over how the Fed handled massive office renovations.
Right. It is a spectacular, crippling collision of institutional mandates. President Trump has stated he wants Kevin Warsh confirmed immediately, but he has also publicly supported the ongoing investigation into Powell, outright stating there is criminality regarding the building expenses.
However, the federal judiciary has stepped in and pushed back hard against the DOJ. Judge James Boasberg recently quashed the government subpoenas into the Federal Reserve. The legal standard for a subpoena requires some baseline suspicion of a crime, and Judge Boasberg ruled that the government has presented no evidence whatsoever of fraud.
So the judicial branch is saying there is no underlying case, but the executive branch's Department of Justice is saying they will absolutely appeal the ruling and keep the probe alive.
Exactly.
And meanwhile, the legislative branch in the Senate cannot confirm the new Fed chair because the probe into the old chair is taking up all the political oxygen. It is total gridlock.
And we are seeing a very similar institutional paralysis over at the Food and Drug Administration. The source documents outline a crisis involving entities called alternative funding programs, or AFPs.
Let's explain how AFPs work, because healthcare costs are a massive pain point for people. If you have a self-funded health plan through your employer and you need an incredibly expensive specialty medication, say a cancer treatment that costs $10,000 a month, your employer's plan might refuse to cover it.
Right, which happens all the time.
What AFPs do is step in as a third party. They essentially bypass the U.S. pharmaceutical pricing system by sourcing more affordable versions of those exact same critical drugs from foreign markets like Canada or the UK and importing them for the patient.
The mechanical problem is that the Department of Homeland Security has stated that this importation practice frequently violates established U.S. import laws.
Oh, wow.
So a nonprofit health policy group called the AIMED Alliance formally petitioned the FDA to step in and issue a specific guidance document. They wanted the FDA to clarify the gray area, to officially write down the regulatory rules for AFPs so employers and patients know what is legal and what isn't.
And the FDA's response was incredibly telling. They essentially replied, "We shared your concerns that some of these imported drugs might be counterfeit or unapproved, but we declined to issue any guidance because doing so is not an efficient use of our limited agency resources."
Yeah, they just punted the issue entirely.
I have to ask about the broader pattern here. Is this overlapping regulatory chaos? From the DOJ investigating the Fed without evidence, to the Senate blocking the Fed nominee, to the FDA throwing up its hands and flat out refusing to clarify life-saving drug laws, is this just a bug in the system? Are we just looking at the symptoms of a bloated, underfunded bureaucracy? Or is institutional uncertainty actually a deliberate, calculated political strategy right now?
That is the essential question bridging all of these sources. Markets, corporations, and individuals crave predictability, right? Jamie Dimon wants predictable capital requirements so he can forecast loan volume. Patients want predictable drug import laws so they can secure their medication.
Yeah.
But political leverage often relies entirely on maintaining ambiguity. If the rules are perfectly clear and set in stone, regulators and politicians lose their discretionary power.
That makes a lot of sense.
If the Fed probe remains open, even without evidence, it maintains constant atmospheric pressure on the institution's independence. In times of hyper-partisanship, keeping the rules murky allows different factions to interpret and enforce them selectively based on the crisis of the day. It is uncertainty weaponized as a tool for leverage.
But the weaponization of uncertainty isn't just an abstract boardroom problem, though. It is actively moving thousands of dollars into and out of the listener's bank account right now.
Absolutely.
Let's look at exactly how shifting government policies and economic pressures are altering domestic wallets. And surprisingly, amidst all this chaos, there is a bit of a windfall for the average taxpayer.
There is. The latest Internal Revenue Service data reveals a significant shift. As of late March, the average tax refund for individual filers is sitting at $3,521.
That's pretty high.
It is. That represents a jump of roughly $350 compared to the exact same time last year.
How mechanically did that happen? Because usually when someone gets a massive tax refund, they haven't actually won the lottery. It just means they accidentally gave the government a larger interest-free loan out of their paycheck throughout the entire year.
That is precisely what happened on a massive national scale, and the mechanics behind it are tied directly to the execution of President Trump's major tax legislation passed last July.
Right.
The legislative bill introduced highly publicized, significant new tax deductions, specifically eliminating taxes on tip income, overtime earnings, Social Security benefits for seniors, and making auto loan interest deductible.
So the tax code changed.
The political branches changed the tax code, yes. However, the administrative branch, the IRS, did not update the withholding tables that employer payroll software uses to calculate how much tax to pull out of an employee's weekly paycheck.
Let's walk through an example of how that software disconnect actually impacts a worker. Say you are a registered nurse working as a W-2 employee and you pick up a ton of overtime shifts. Throughout the entire back half of last year, your hospital's payroll software was looking at the old IRS table.
Right, it didn't know the law changed.
Exactly. It was taking taxes out of your overtime check every single week as if you still owed the old, higher tax rate. You effectively overpaid the government every week, and now, when you finally file your return, the system reconciles the new law with the old withholding, and you get it all back in a lump sum.
Exactly. It acts as a stealthy, mandatory savings account enforced by bureaucratic delay. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent noted that the overtime deduction alone has been claimed on 25% of all returns filed so far.
That's huge.
It translates to nearly 20 million individual filings experiencing this exact mechanical discrepancy. It results in a massive, sudden injection of liquidity for households, right as the broader economy wrestles with the inflation we discussed earlier.
And the government is actively rolling out another direct financial mechanism called Trump accounts, which are slated to launch on July 4th. The Treasury has designated the Bank of New York Mellon, BNY, as the official financial agent, but they are partnering with the retail trading app Robinhood to build out the actual user interface and infrastructure.
Yeah, and the mechanical details of these accounts are designed to aggressively promote generational wealth building. If an individual has a child born between the years 2025 and 2028, the Treasury will deposit a one-time $1,000 seed payment directly into this tax-deferred investing account.
That's a nice start.
Beyond that initial government seed, parents, friends, or family members can contribute up to $5,000 annually in after-tax dollars. Furthermore, corporations can utilize the accounts as an employee benefit, depositing up to $2,500 pre-tax.
The IRS data shows that over 4 million children have already been signed up for the broader initiative, with 1 million currently eligible for the specific pilot program. It is an attempt to democratize long-term savings by utilizing a frictionless fintech platform like Robinhood, moving away from cumbersome legacy banking interfaces.
Right.
But while the government creates new avenues for building wealth, consumers are simultaneously watching the value of their existing alternative wealth completely erode. I'm talking specifically about credit card points.
Yes. The source materials included a deep dive from CNBC's Points Pro, Jason Stauffer, detailing the silent attrition of loyalty rewards.
How so?
The mechanism of devaluation is directly tied to the inflation we discussed in the travel sector. As the cash price of flights and hotels rises, driven by factors like the $4.65 jet fuel, airlines and hotel chains are quietly adjusting the algorithms governing their points ecosystems.
They are inflating the points currency.
Precisely. The amount of points required to book a Standard Saver award flight used to be a fixed number. Now, it's totally dynamic. If the cash price of the ticket doubles, the airline's algorithm doubles the points required to book it.
So Stauffer's advice is a complete reversal of the old mindset. You should not hoard your points for a dream vacation 5 years from now. You should book your flights as far in advance as possible the moment you accumulate enough rewards, because the purchasing power of that digital currency is mathematically guaranteed to drop.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean? When you look at the mechanics of this, holding on to credit card points right now is essentially like hoarding fresh milk in the fridge.
Yeah.
It is absolutely going to spoil. You might have 100,000 points today, which feels rich, but in 5 years, that might not even cover a domestic economy ticket.
It's true.
Does that same use it or lose it mindset apply to how people should view their tax strategies and these new government benefits, given the weaponized political uncertainty we discussed in the boardrooms?
Without question. Policy is never permanent. The specific tax deductions generating these $3,500 refunds exist under the current legislative reality, but future administrations facing massive national deficits could easily alter or repeal them.
That's a good point.
The Robinhood Trump accounts are launching now, but the rules governing tax-deferred growth are subject to constant congressional revision. Treating government benefits, tax loopholes, or corporate reward points as permanent, foundational fixtures of a multi-decade financial plan is incredibly risky. You must optimize for the rules exactly as they exist today while maintaining the flexibility to pivot your strategy tomorrow.
And speaking of shifting financial strategies, you might take that $3,500 tax windfall and want to invest it. Normally, you would hire a financial advisor, but what the data shows is that a massive technological paradigm shift is actively rewriting who we trust with our money.
And it is simultaneously tearing through the labor market.
Yes. Let's look at the artificial intelligence disruption, starting with the human toll on the college class of 2026, because they are walking into an absolute buzzsaw.
The macroeconomic statistics for young professionals are grim. According to data from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the unemployment rate for recent college graduates spiked to 5.7% in the fourth quarter of 2025.
And to contextualize that, it is significantly higher than the overall national unemployment rate of 4.2%.
Exactly. Larry Fink, the CEO of the massive asset manager BlackRock, specifically warned that this year's graduates are facing the most hostile jobless rate in years. The underlying mechanism driving this is that generative AI is actively making traditional entry-level roles functionally obsolete.
The jobs where young professionals historically cut their teeth and learned the industry. Writing basic code, drafting preliminary copywriting, compiling junior-level data entries, summarizing legal briefs. Those tasks are being swallowed whole by language models.
The software does it in seconds for fractions of a penny.
Right, so what are these graduates supposed to do while the market restructures? The experts in the source files outline pure survival tactics. Staying on your parents' health insurance plan until you are 26 is statistically the least costly option.
Applying for Medicaid or SNFP food benefits if your taxable income has flatlined.
Utilizing state-funded job placement services, and critically, leaning heavily on the 6-month grace period for federal student loans, utilizing the window where the government covers the interest on subsidized loans while you scramble to find a foothold in a shrinking labor pool.
The profound irony of this transition is that while AI algorithms are displacing young workers from payrolls, those exact same young workers are turning directly to AI algorithms for financial salvation.
Wait, really?
Yeah. A recent Intuit poll highlighted in the sources showed that 66% of the general population who use generative AI have asked it for specific financial advice.
Wow.
And when you filter that data for Gen Z and millennials, the usage rate jumps to an astounding 82%.
But relying on a chatbot for your financial future terrifies the academic establishment. Andrew Lo, a finance professor at MIT, issued a very stark warning about this trend.
He did.
He acknowledged that AI absolutely possesses the mathematical and historical financial expertise to effectively replace a human advisor. It can build a diversified portfolio in its sleep. But he argued it fundamentally lacks one critical, non-technical component, a fiduciary duty.
Right. And the concept of a fiduciary duty is the bedrock of professional wealth management. Under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, a fiduciary is legally and ethically bound by a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. They must put the client's best financial interest ahead of their own corporate profits or commissions.
Okay, so if a human advisor violates that trust, if they steer you into a terrible investment just to secure a kickback, they face severe consequences. They can be stripped of their licenses, face ruinous civil liabilities, and even be prosecuted criminally.
Exactly. Professor Lowe points out the mechanical flaw of AI. An algorithm cannot suffer consequences.
Right, it doesn't care.
It cannot be sent to a federal penitentiary. It cannot have its wages garnished. Therefore, a retail user is flying completely blind, executing algorithmic financial advice with zero legal recourse or safety net. If that AI makes a catastrophic error and wipes out their life savings.
Let me push back on the MIT professor's logic here, though, because it feels a bit disconnected from reality. If a human advisor gives me terrible advice and loses my retirement fund, sure, they technically have legal liability.
Right.
But do I, as an average retail investor, actually have the millions of dollars in legal fees and the years of time required to successfully sue a massive Wall Street wealth management firm?
Probably not.
Exactly. The traditional fiduciary model is heavily gatekept by wealth. You usually need a massive minimum balance just to get in the door. Isn't a free AI, even if it occasionally hallucinates a bad math calculation, actively democratizing financial literacy for millions of people who could never afford a human fiduciary in the first place?
Your counter-argument is exactly the debate dominating fintech right now. You are weighing the democratization of accessibility against the potential for catastrophic systemic risk. You are entirely correct that bespoke human financial planning is an exclusionary luxury. AI shatters that barrier to entry instantly.
Right.
However, Professor Lowe's concern extends beyond a single user getting bad advice. He is worried about the systemic scale of errors.
Oh, I see.
If a human advisor makes a mistake, one portfolio suffers. If a heavily relied upon AI model hallucinates a flawed tax optimization strategy and 3 million Gen Z users execute it simultaneously on their Robinhood accounts, the financial devastation to the market is instantaneous, massive, and entirely unrecoverable.
That's a terrifying scenario.
The AI democratizes access, but it equally democratizes the scale of potential ruin.
And while academic regulators panic about chatbots giving stock tips to college kids, corporate America is completely restructuring their entire balance sheets to buy as much of this computational power as physically possible.
It's an absolute arms race.
Oracle just announced a massive corporate leadership change. They appointed Hillary Maxson as their new chief financial officer. Maxson previously managed a $45 billion energy automation company. And the industry analysis indicates Oracle hired her specifically to mathematically steer the company through the massive, heavy debt load they are intentionally taking on to fuel their AI infrastructure spending.
They are borrowing billions to build the data centers that train these models. And we are seeing the physical, commercial manifestation of that heavy compute spending in sectors you wouldn't expect, like retail apparel.
Yes, the retail sector currently suffers from an $849.9 billion returns problem. Nearly 20% of all online sales are returned.
Which is staggering.
Retail returns are a massive problem. We've all done it. You buy 3 sizes of the same jacket, keep the one that fits, and send the other 2 back in a poly mailer. But looking at the source materials, the financial scale of that habit is crazy.
The industry term for that specific consumer behavior is bracketing, and it completely destroys operating margins. When you mail those 2 jackets back, the retailer cannot simply hang them back on a rack.
Right. They have to process them.
The logistical cost of receiving, inspecting, chemically cleaning, and repackaging that garment often exceeds the manufacturing profit margin. Consequently, a massive percentage of returned inventory is simply written off as a loss, liquidated to discount brokers, or sent directly to landfills.
So the industry is looking at this hemorrhaging balance sheet and realizing they need to stop the return before the checkout button is even clicked.
Exactly.
And that brings us to a startup highlighted in the documents called Catches, founded by Ed Voice. They are attempting to solve this with heavy AI compute. They aren't just overlaying a flat JPEG of a shirt onto a photo of you like an old Snapchat filter. They use NVIDIA's CADA platform to create a highly accurate digital twin of the user that incorporates the actual physics of fabric texture. Let's define CAD for a second, because that's a term that gets thrown around a lot in the AI hardware space. But what does it actually do mechanically?
CUD is essentially a parallel computing platform and programming model created by NVIDIA. Instead of a traditional computer processor thinking about one massive problem sequentially, very quickly, CUD allows the graphics processing unit, the GPU, to break a problem down and think about thousands of tiny mathematical calculations simultaneously.
Okay, so how does that help with clothes?
In the context of virtual apparel try-ons, simulating fabric is computationally brutal. You aren't just displaying an image, you are calculating how millions of individual digital threads bend, stretch, weigh down, and collide with each other in real time when draped over the unique topographical contours of a moving human body.
Oh, wow. So it calculates how a heavy wool sweater hangs differently than a silk shirt.
Precisely. And Zara is rolling out similar virtual try-on technology to ensure customers buy the right size the first time, while simultaneously charging customers a physical fee for mail-in returns to actively penalize and change their bracketing behavior.
And the compute required to run those physics simulations is exactly why companies like Oracle are going deeply into debt to build data centers. But at the absolute pinnacle of this industry, the companies building the foundational brains of these systems, the battle for control is degenerating into intense legal warfare.
Yeah, OpenAI has just sent a formal, aggressive letter to the Attorneys General of California and Delaware, urging them to initiate a probe into Elon Musk for improper and anti-competitive behavior.
The details of this corporate warfare are wild. Jason Kwan, OpenAI's strategy chief, is alleging in this letter that Elon Musk is actively coordinating with Meta's Mark Zuckerberg to undermine OpenAI's market position.
It's quite the accusation.
Musk, who actually co-founded OpenAI back in 2015 before leaving to start his own rival firm called xAI, is currently suing OpenAI in civil court. Jury selection for that massive trial begins on April 27th. OpenAI is legally claiming that Musk's true motive is to seize control of artificial general intelligence AGI, stripping it away from OpenAI's mission-driven safety principles and consolidating it into the hands of competitors who lack rigorous safety guardrails.
And, the transition from digital algorithms wrestling for control in the cloud to the physical world implications brings us perfectly to the next layer of our analysis. Because all of this AI computation, all of these massive corporate debt restructurings, and all of these legal battles, they require physical space, massive electrical grids, and human leadership to execute.
They don't just exist in the cloud.
Exactly. And that reality is radically altering the commercial real estate map and executive dynamics across the country.
Let's look at the commercial real estate market in Manhattan. It is experiencing a massive, counterintuitive shock under the administration of the new Democratic Socialist mayor, Zohran Mamdani. Now, remember earlier when we analyzed Jamie Dimon's shareholder letter? In that exact same letter, Dimon explicitly warned that major corporations are actively fleeing New York for lower tax havens like Texas and Florida because of burdensome local regulations and costs. He noted that J.P. Morgan actually employs more people in Dallas now than in New York.
Yeah, and given the macroeconomic headwinds and the rise of remote work, the baseline expectation among analysts was a massive, sustained corporate exodus from Manhattan office space.
That makes sense.
But the Q1 2026 data compiled by JLL completely shattered that expectation. Manhattan office vacancies actually dropped by 2.2%, falling to 13.5%. Furthermore, average leasing rents rose by 3.5%.
And the primary driver of this real estate boom is the exact technology we were just dissecting, AI. Artificial intelligence firms accounted for roughly half of all the new leasing volume in the first quarter. They are panic leasing massive premium office spaces. A company called Nenscale Global Holdings just signed a lease at the prestigious One Vanderbilt building for an astonishing $320 per square foot. That represents the highest commercial rent ever recorded in the history of New York City.
It's unbelievable.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because I look at the New York real estate market right now, like an exclusive nightclub with an absolutely outrageous cover charge. You have all these traditional legacy finance executives standing out on the sidewalk in the cold, loudly complaining about the local taxes, complaining about the regulations, and threatening to move their operations to Miami.
Yeah, threatening to walk away.
But they ultimately stay in line and pay the exorbitant cover charge because inside that specific club is where the absolute best, most crucial AI engineering talent is partying. Why does an industry focused on building decentralized, cloud-based digital minds insist on physical agglomeration?
That's a great question.
Is this just a temporary .com style land grab where these startups will burn through their venture capital and flame out in 2 years? Or are we witnessing a permanent physical realignment of corporate hubs?
Well, the psychology of agglomeration is fascinating. Despite the tools of remote work, highly complex, bleeding-edge innovation still heavily relies on localized proximity. The serendipitous exchange of ideas that happens when brilliant engineers occupy the same physical space.
So they need to be in the same room.
Basically, yeah. However, JLL's analysis did warn that this current leasing velocity feels ominously reminiscent of the late 90s .com boom.
I was just thinking that.
Many of these AI firms are signing leases for significantly more square footage than their current employee headcount actually requires. They are leasing purely based on wildly optimistic projected hiring models.
Wow.
They are demanding highly flexible, modular lease structures that can be rapidly reconfigured. If the AI investment bubble bursts, or if the technology evolved to seamlessly support decentralized workflows without losing innovative momentum, that $320 per square foot lease at One Vanderbilt instantly transforms from a status symbol into a lethal corporate liability. It is a massive, high-stakes gamble on the necessity of physical proximity.
And it is not just the physical buildings that are shifting under the weight of these transitions. It is the human beings occupying the corner offices inside them. The source materials provide a fascinating psychological case study regarding the executive transition happening at Berkshire Hathaway.
Oh, yeah.
Warren Buffett, arguably the most legendary investor in modern history, finally stepped down as CEO on December 31st. He officially handed the operational reins to his handpicked successor, Greg Abel. However, Buffett is still serving as the chairman of the board, and crucially, he still comes into the corporate office every single day.
Right. Managing an executive transition where your former boss, especially a titan with the historical gravity of Warren Buffett, now essentially reports to you, is one of the most delicate, fraught challenges in corporate leadership.
I can't even imagine.
Workplace psychology experts like Amy Gallo and Zoe Frigoux note in the files that this dynamic carries significant operational risks. The newly installed CEO might feel constantly undermined, second-guessing their strategic instincts. More dangerously, the broader employee base might experience role confusion, quietly questioning who is actually making the final decisions.
Right. If Greg Abel is running a meeting, but Warren Buffett is sitting just down the hall in his old office, who are the portfolio managers really looking to for approval?
Hmm.
Who are they trying to impress?
Exactly. But the experts also argue that if this dynamic is managed correctly, it becomes an unparalleled corporate superpower. You do not lose decades of compounded institutional knowledge.
How do you manage it correctly, though?
The psychological key to success is for the new CEO to explicitly treat the former leader as a revered senior advisor, actively seeking their counsel on macro trends, while firmly holding the line on daily operational authority. Abel has to avoid the dual extremes. He cannot aggressively assert dominance too quickly, alienating Buffett, but he also cannot endlessly delay tough operational calls simply to preserve the comfort of the old dynamic.
Moving beyond internal leadership dynamics, we are seeing equally massive strategic pivots happening on a macro corporate level, entirely independent of the AI software boom. For example, in the hard sciences of the biotech sector, Neurocrine Biosciences just executed a massive $2.9 billion cash buyout of a company called Soleno Therapeutics.
Right, and this acquisition represents a profound pivot for Neurocrine. Historically, Neurocrine's entire research and development pipeline has focused on neuroscience and neurological disorders.
So brains, not bodies.
Mostly, yes.
Right.
But by acquiring Soleno, they are making a multi-billion-dollar leap into the metabolic disease space. The crown jewel of this acquisition is a drug called VYKAT XR.
Let's explain the mechanics of what this drug actually does, because it targets a very specific, devastating condition. VYKAT XR treats hyperphagia, which is an intense, persistent neurological hunger associated with a rare genetic disorder called Prader-Willi syndrome.
And the clinical reality of Prader-Willi syndrome is harrowing. It affects the hypothalamus, the region of the brain that regulates appetite. Patients with this syndrome never register the sensation of feeling full.
That's terrible.
They experience a literal biological starvation response constantly, regardless of how much they eat. It leads to severe, life-threatening obesity and catastrophic metabolic cascading failures. Soleno's drug, VYKAT XR, targets these specific neural pathways to suppress that insatiable hunger.
So why does a neuroscience company suddenly want to be in the metabolic business? The context here is the massive success of GLP-1 weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy. Those drugs prove that the market for pharmaceutical metabolic intervention is practically infinite.
Yes. Neurocrine is recognizing that treating the neurological root cause of hunger is the gateway to dominating the next generation of metabolic therapeutics. Analysts project VYKAT XR alone will generate over $2 billion globally by the mid-2030s.
It is a calculated pivot to capture the most lucrative sector in modern medicine. And while biotech companies pivot to capture new markets, other industries are being forced to pivot because massive legacy markets are violently shutting them out.
Which brings us to Hollywood.
Yes, this brings us to the profound structural crisis facing the American entertainment industry, specifically Hollywood's relationship with China. For over a decade, the entire business model of the American blockbuster was predicated on global scale. The Chinese box office was the ultimate kingmaker.
It was guaranteed money.
If a studio greenlit a massive action movie, they knew that if it secured a release date in China, it was virtually guaranteed to gross $1 billion worldwide. The financial risk was mitigated by Chinese consumption. But looking at the source data, that era of cultural synergy is effectively permanently over.
Yeah, the box office data compiled by ComScore illustrates a staggering collapse. Due to shifting government content controls, stringent censorship, and a massive state-sponsored mandate to promote homegrown Chinese intellectual property, Hollywood is getting systematically locked out of the theaters.
The numbers are wild.
In the year 2019, 9 different U.S. film titles generated over $100 million each at the Chinese box office. It was a reliable, massive revenue stream. However, in the entire past 5 years combined, only 10 U.S. films have crossed that $100 million mark.
And it is not a lack of quality or global appeal. Look at the recent Super Mario Bros. Animated movie. It was a cultural juggernaut, making $1.3 billion globally, but it only scraped together a dismal $25 million in China.
Why did it fail so badly there?
Because the underlying intellectual property, the nostalgia for playing Nintendo consoles in the 1980s and 90s, simply doesn't exist in a country that formally banned video game consoles for over a decade. The cultural touchstones have completely decoupled.
Right. And the only recent anomaly to this downward trend was Disney's animated sequel, Zootopia 2, which broke regional records with a $650 million gross in China.
But financial analysts are aggressively warning studios not to interpret that success as a return to the old normal. The market has fundamentally decoupled. China is building its own massive state-backed studio system, producing nationalist epics that dominate their domestic screens. Hollywood can no longer rely on foreign box office to subsidize massive domestic production budgets.
Yeah.
Well, we have spent this entire expansive deep dive looking at how humanity meticulously fragments and divides itself. We draw invisible lines over ocean straits to block energy. We bicker over the minutiae of tax withholding tables. We fight territorial wars over premium Manhattan office space. And we build cultural walls to restrict what movies can play in which countries.
We really do.
But to conclude today's session, we are going to look at how humanity physically travels and examine how our perspective radically changes the higher up into the atmosphere you go.
And the contrast between the terrestrial systems we've discussed and our endeavors in space is truly stark. If you look at the current state of commercial aviation down here on Earth, the prevailing economic trend is hypersegmentation. The source materials detail how United Airlines is rolling out a brand new fare class called Base Polaris for its international business class cabins.
Now, Polaris is United's flagship luxury product. It's the pod with the lie-flat bed, the premium dining, the whole experience.
Right.
But with the introduction of Base Polaris, the airline is taking that luxury tier and brutally stripping away all the associated perks. You want to select your seat in advance. That is a separate fee.
Of course it is.
You want to access the high-end Polaris lounge to take a shower before your 14-hour flight. Access denied. Your base ticket only grants you entry to the standard crowded United Club. You only get one checked bag instead of two, and you absolutely cannot change your ticket if your plans alter.
It is the ultimate cynical expression of earthly nickel and diming. You are paying thousands of dollars for a premium physical space, yet you are still being artificially separated from the passenger sitting 3 feet next to you based on a hidden tier of arbitrary fees.
They are meticulously slicing the front of the airplane cabin into microstrata just to extract every single marginal dollar from the post-pandemic luxury travel boom.
But if we pull our perspective back way, way back beyond the atmosphere, we see a completely different, profoundly unifying narrative playing out with NASA's Artemis II mission.
This is the mission that just made absolute, unprecedented history. The 4 astronauts on board the Orion capsule, 3 Americans and 1 Canadian, just broke the all-time human distance record set by the Apollo 13 crew back in 1970.
Amazing.
They traveled an astonishing 248,655 miles away from Earth, and they accomplished this using a specific navigational mechanic called a free return lunar trajectory. Let's explain the physics of that because it is elegant.
It really is a marvel of orbital mechanics. Instead of firing massive rocket engines to force the capsule to turn around and come home, which requires carrying heavy, dangerous fuel, the spacecraft is precisely aimed to fly behind the moon.
Oh, so it just uses gravity.
Exactly. It uses the massive gravitational pull of the moon to catch the capsule, whip it around the dark side, and slingshot it directly back toward Earth in a massive figure-8 pattern. It is an elegant use of natural physics to ensure the crew returns safely without relying on mechanical propulsion.
And the human details of this mission, as they executed that slingshot around the far side of the moon, are profoundly moving.
They really are.
As they passed over the lunar surface, the crew observed 2 completely fresh, previously unmapped lunar craters. They radioed Mission Control in Houston and asked for formal permission to name them. They named the first crater Integrity, serving as a tribute to the structural and moral integrity of their Orion capsule.
And the mission commander, Reed Wiseman, requested that the second crater be named Carroll in direct honor of his late wife, who passed away from cancer in 2020. The official NASA reports noted that all 4 astronauts, suspended in the void of space, embraced in tears as the request was formally approved by Earth.
I want you to really think about that juxtaposition. Down here, tethered to gravity, we are drawing invisible arbitrary lines in an airplane cabin to separate a base Polaris passenger from a flexible Polaris passenger. We are engaged in bitter financial arguments over who gets to use an airport shower.
Yeah.
But from 250,000 miles away, looking back at us, astronaut Victor Glover articulated it best. He looked at the entirety of the Earth and realized it is just a tiny, fragile oasis of unity floating in an unfathomable amount of nothingness.
What Glover experienced is a documented psychological phenomenon known as the overview effect.
The overview effect.
Right. It is a profound cognitive shift reported by nearly all astronauts when they view the Earth from deep space. The national boundaries we fight over simply vanish.
They just don't matter anymore.
Exactly. The geopolitical conflicts we discussed at the top of the hour, the managed blockades in the Strait of Hormuz, the political warfare over the Federal Reserve's leadership, the frantic turf wars over AI regulation, they do not disappear, but their context is radically, fundamentally altered.
You realize that the continued survival of that tiny oasis requires a baseline level of human cooperation that our current highly fragmented geopolitical systems are severely struggling to maintain.
It really puts the shock of paying an extra dollar for groceries into a sobering perspective.
So let's quickly recap the massive journey we took today. We started in the tense, contested waters of the Strait of Hormuz, watching global energy supplies act as a bouncer at the door of the economy. We watched corporate titans clash with regulators over the intricate mechanics of banking capital rules.
We tracked the software glitch that gave you a tax refund bump and the inflation that devalued your credit card points.
We explored how artificial intelligence is simultaneously threatening the livelihoods of the class of 2026, revolutionizing the physics of retail returns, and driving a record-breaking, agglomeration-fueled real estate boom in Manhattan.
And finally, we flew past the far side of the moon to remember that despite all our relentless earthly divisions, we are all sharing the exact same ride through the dark.
It is an immense amount of systemic information to process.
It is. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final lingering thought. It circles back to the MIT professor's severe warning regarding AI financial advisors. He argued that the ultimate barrier preventing an AI from acting as a true legal fiduciary is that a machine cannot suffer consequences.
Right, it can't be legally punished.
Exactly. But what happens when we inevitably integrate artificial intelligence so deeply into our societal infrastructure, managing our wealth, routing our supply chains, diagnosing our diseases, that we are forced to create novel legal structures where it can suffer consequences?
What would that even look like?
Could a sophisticated AI be legally required to hold a massive financial escrow account to independently pay out malpractice fines? If an AI commits a catastrophic systemic error that destroys lives, could its underlying code be legally deleted as a modern form of capital punishment?
Wow.
If liability and the capacity to be punished are what truly make us human in the eyes of the law, how long until we figure out a mechanism to legally punish a machine?
That is a wild, paradigm-shifting thought to end on, because if we are already pulling all these hidden levers in the escape room of the global economy, eventually we have to figure out who or what is actually locked in there with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today. For you listening, keep pulling those threads, keep questioning the mechanics of the systems around you, and never stop looking for the hidden connections. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.